This week on The Wheelhouse. Commutations in Connecticut. And a little later, medical aid in dying. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. Commutations, or the process of reducing prison sentences, has become the political issue in recent weeks. Why? Well, Republican lawmakers have expressed concerns over a recent spike in commutations. Last year, Connecticut's Board of Pardons and Paroles commuted the prison sentences of 71 people, including 44 doing time for murder. Following the outcry, Governor Ned Lamont removed Carleton Giles as chair of the Board of Pardons and Paroles. The board also paused commutations until there can be a thorough review of its policies and processes. So how did we get here? For that and more, we're joined by three great guests, including, to my left here in studio, Christopher Keating, Capitol Bureau Chief, Hartford Courant. Thank you for joining us. Big Mets fan, Christopher Keating as well, just like me.
Hello, good morning. How's things?
Things are good, especially because I got you to my left in the studio. And on Zoom, we have a little bit of a New Haven contingent going. First, the clinical professor of law, Yale Law School, Miriam Gohara. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Miriam.
Thank you for inviting me, Frankie. I'm excited to be in conversation about this important issue.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And also on Zoom as well this morning, Mike Lawler, professor of criminal justice, University of New Haven, former criminal justice advisor, former undersecretary of criminal justice for Governor Daniel Malloy. Good morning, Mike.
Morning, Frankie. How you doing?
I'm doing well because I get to have this conversation with the three of you. And we're going to start in a second. Just want to let folks know they can join the conversation. The number to call is 888-720-9677. Chris, you get the first question. Before we get into the weeds kind of this issue, I got to ask, is it surprising to you that commutations have become this major political issue?
I would definitely say yes. If you asked 6 months ago, a year ago, what are the hot issues, commutations really, frankly, have never been a super hot issue. By that, I mean, kind of at the top of the agenda where the governor had to get involved, where the governor replaced the chair, overnight or however it was done. So, yes, I would not have think this came out of the blue to me as somebody who's been at the Capitol since Lowell Weicker and has been following it for even longer than that.
Mike, your thoughts on that?
Well, in some ways it was kind of predictable, right? This is a relatively new phenomenon, and I think a lot of people were taken by surprise about how it works. Maybe that's partially the fault of folks who should have been sort of teeing this up a little bit, explaining it ahead of time, sort of publicly to have people engaged in it. But at the end of the day, I perhaps more than most people, I know exactly what was going on here. And I think it makes perfect sense. And I think the more you come to understand it, the more reasonable it will sound. And hopefully that's what will happen over the next months
and Miriam,
year.
And Miriam, when we're looking at this issue 2 months ago, I'm seeing some emails from Senate Republicans about this issue, and it's not really hitting 2.5, 3 months ago. And now look at where we are, sort of 2.5, 3 months later, and commutations have been suspended.
Well, the reason that it wasn't an issue is because of what Mike said. It was sensible. It was the board doing its job. It was the board acting as it was intended to. The board had carefully considered the criteria that it was going to use, and it had weighed the seriousness of the crime as well as victims' wishes and whether the sentence was continuing to serve a relevant purpose and was still necessary decades into people's time served in prison. So the board was functioning well, and Connecticut has a good structure that doesn't leave the commutation or clemency power exclusively with the governor, but rather delegates it through the legislature to a board of experts, and the experts were doing their jobs, and that's why it was not controversial. To the extent that there were misunderstandings, which I'm happy to discuss a little later in the show, I think Mike is correct that those were not the board's fault.
And Miriam, while I have you here, You talked about clemency. You talked about commutation. Commutation versus pardon versus clemency. Can you break down the difference?
Sure. So clemency is kind of an umbrella term that describes the reduction of a criminal sentence. And clemency can take two forms. The first is pardons. And in Connecticut, pardons erase an individual's criminal history. And the board only grants pardons to people who have already served their sentences. The second way that we think of clemency in the state of Connecticut is commutations, and that reduces the sentence of a currently incarcerated person who's demonstrated rehabilitation. And that's exactly what the board was doing. The commutation is a way of recognizing that the original sentence is no longer necessary or appropriate. And it's important to say that in Connecticut, commutation was only granted to people who had already served many, many years in prison. This was not letting people out after short prison terms. So that's the general distinction between commutations and pardons under the umbrella of clemency.
Mike, give me your take on the history of the Board of Pardons and Paroles in Connecticut.
Well, there's two important dates or changes to keep in mind. First is in the aftermath of the Cheshire murders, which took place in 2007. During the 2008 legislative session, and I was a member then, I was chair of the Judiciary Committee and directly involved in this stuff. The board was completely reconstituted, reprioritized, staffed up, given many more resources, and new standards were imposed about who can be on the board and how they get approved. So, for example, now board members, based on the 2008 reform, have to be approved by the Judiciary Committee. It used to be a more sort of rubber stamp type process in the past, and also go through both houses of the legislature. And that's what you see playing out now. But also the staffing, the risk assessment tools that were adopted as a result, were all geared to identifying who among those who are incarcerated pose little or no risk to the community, and under what circumstances should people be eligible for any type of early release. And I think one thing that confuses people is they're just not aware of the wide variety of options for taking people who are serving a sentence and allowing them into the community, whether it's in a halfway house or whatever. And so next comes 2012, when the Connecticut Sentencing Commission recommends that the way the state should follow what United States Supreme Court had imposed, which is basically a requirement that people who were under 18 when they committed a crime should have the opportunity to make a new case after they've served many years in prison. So interestingly, and sort of ironically now, when that was all worked through by all the relevant stakeholders, judges, prosecutors, victim advocates, et cetera, the agreement was, let's have the parole board make these decisions rather than courts. And that was actually suggested by the actual prosecutors. That's why it's so ironic for me to see today some of the state's prosecutors saying, like, well, why should these people be making the decision? Well, the last time we went through this discussion, that was the end result. And my sense is, since the governor is beginning a series of meetings, convening all the stakeholders, how should we do this going forward? I think they end up in the same place they did 10 years ago, which is, let's make sure the board is properly staffed, they have the right criteria, and they make these decisions on a case by case.
Mike says that the board makes these decisions. Miriam, does the board need to inform the governor or lawmakers? How does that kind of commutation process work when they're making these decisions?
It's important to understand that the system was set up dating back to the 1880s, that the legislature delegated its authority to commute sentences to the Board of Pardons and Paroles. And so when people allege that this process is undemocratic, that's actually not true, because it's the democratically elected representatives of the people in the state of Connecticut who delegated their authority to the board and entrusted the board to use its expertise to assess when a sentence should be commuted. The governor appoints the board members, and so presumably there's a robust vetting process for who ends up on the board. And the legislature then confirms or reconfirms. That's actually where the flashpoint happened here at this time with regard to the question of commutations. The Republicans seized on the reconfirmation of board members, including the former board chair, Carleton Giles, to raise the issue of whether commutations were being handled appropriately. And again, I can speak later about the very narrow way in which they went about making those criticisms. But it ended up blowing up and calling into question whether the board was doing its job, when in fact the board was doing its job as delegated by the legislature
Yeah,
again,
continue that part. What was the board's job, I guess, in recent years?
The board's job, the board had carefully repromulgated its guidelines for commutation several years ago. And in fact, one of the reasons that people are raising concerns is because they're claiming that there's been a floodgates of of commutation grants. The only reason that that a number of people applied for commutations, a higher number than had happened over the past decades, is because the commutation process had essentially been halted for many years. And it was officially halted for several years right before the pandemic, while the board repromulgated its guidelines for deciding when commutations would be appropriate. When they reopened the process, of course, there were a number of people who were eligible for commutations who were going to apply. Now, that number was going to naturally level out because you are not eligible for commutation until you've served at least 10 years of a sentence. And if you're sentenced, and only if you're sentenced to over 10 years. So there are only a certain number of people in the state of Connecticut who even fit that criteria. It just happened that a number of them, that while commutations were paused, there was no avenue for them to apply. But once it reopened, there was going to be, of course, applications that were considered. It's important to say that the board, when it was weighing the criteria, and I'm happy to discuss the criteria, the board considers, this is according to its own website, the seriousness and recentness of the conviction, the impact on the victims, the institutional record of the applicant, and a number of other factors, including the extent to which the applicant has been rehabilitated and the length of their sentence. And the board was considering all of those factors, doing its job, using its expertise to decide whether people who applied were worthy of commutation. And the board granted commutations in less than 30% of the cases that came before it. That means that it denied commutations in over 70% of the cases that came before it after weighing these factors. And so the suggestion that the board was overreaching or somehow expanding its authority in some ways completely contrary to the facts.
I just want to add two things, if I could, very quickly for your listeners. Just keep in mind in the back of your heads when we talk about pardons and paroles and all that, just remember on the federal level, Trump was basically doing whatever he wanted. There's an entire group over at DOJ that looks through these pardons, and that was kind of pushed aside, and Trump would pardon whoever he wanted, Roger Stone or Manafort or anybody like that. Second thing is, in Connecticut, it's totally different, as Speaker Lawler had mentioned. Cuomo in New York had tremendous power, and a lot of governors had tremendous power in this process, and Lamont simply just does not. Just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and Chris, just that, Connecticut is the only state where the governor does not have the power to issue commutations.
The only
Every
state?
other state has a clear mechanism for doing it, and ultimately it comes down to what the governor does. But in most states, there's some sort of panel that's convened to sort of vet this stuff, as you just heard from Chris. And, I think there's another thing that people need to keep in mind, and that is how much the prison population has changed over time. So now it used to be most people incarcerated in Connecticut were younger, like under age 30. Now that's the smallest group. The only group that's getting bigger in our prison population are the over 60-year-olds. And the number one crime for which people are incarcerated in Connecticut now is murder. It used to be violation of probation. So things have changed a lot. And so we have these people who had been sentenced to these 50, 60, 70-year sentences in the 1990s for stuff they had done at age 19, 20, 21, which wasn't like a sociopath, was out like a serial killer. These are typically young African American and Latino guys in our cities who are carrying guns around, and one just has better aim than the other. It's a lot of that. Not that it's okay, but many of these guys have served 20 or 30 years already. And if you met them today, which I have, I've been in the prisons, I've met these guys who've come out. We have 2 full-time students at our university who just got out of prison, one of whom was 15 years old when he was sentenced to 55 years in prison for an arson in Bridgeport, right? And if you met this guy today at age 40, the last thing you would think is this guy is some sort of criminal, right? I mean, these are people that have completely changed. They've completely grown up. They pose no risk to anybody, and they've served more time for their crimes than you would in any other country in the world that we would like to be compared to, right? These are unheard of sentences in most of the rest of the world.
If you got thoughts on commutations in Connecticut and you're listening to us, please join the conversation. 888-720-9677, 888-720-WNPR. Mike, I want to just ask you really quickly, why have we seen this uptick in commutations in the past year? Is it very consistent with what we were talking about with Miriam earlier, where there's this backlog? What do you attribute it to?
Well, there is. I mean, you have all these people serving these really, really long sentences, and because of a lot of the reforms that were enacted in the 90s, many of which I actually voted for, just to be clear, there's no other options available besides this one. I mean, many of these guys are just not eligible for parole at all. Many of these guys got sentences like 50, 60, 70 years to serve. Many of these guys are already 50, 60 years old. Almost all of these guys have served 20 or 30 years already. So now you have this big cohort that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger in the prison system all the time. Also, when you take this possibility of having your sentence reduced a little bit away, you're going to see repercussions within the prisons themselves, right? I see firsthand, going into like the Shrew unit at Cheshire, for the first time, these older guys who've been locked up for a long time feel like there is a way they can give back. They can demonstrate that they're different people, right? If you take away that remote possibility that they might have a shot at having their sentence reduced a little bit, then you're definitely going to see repercussions in incidents in the prisons. And so there's so many substantive reasons to have this. And as Miriam said, most of the people who asked for a commutation didn't even get a hearing, right? And those are the people who are identified by this specially trained board as the people who do continue to pose a threat, or the nature of their crime was so off the charts horrible that it stands apart from these other cases. There was one guy that the board gave a commutation to who went to trial because he was charged with felony murder, meaning he was with some other guy that committed a murder. He didn't pull the trigger himself. He went to trial. He gets like 60 years to serve. The guys who actually did the shooting got 20 years to serve, and they're already out. And so, because they pleaded guilty, right? So it's this stuff that when you look at it in retrospect, really makes no sense.
Former state representative, former state official Mike Lawler on Zoom, and there's Miriam Gohara. Go ahead, Miriam.
Sorry, I was going to jump in to highlight a couple of things Mike said. One, the average age of the people who the board commuted their sentences was 22.6 at the time they committed their crime. So again, this is to underscore the point that these were young people. These were people who were not hardened criminals necessarily, or people who were well into the ages of maturity when they committed their crimes. And now they are much more mature. And it's important because we understand, in part because of neuroscience and the Supreme Court's recognition that people are more impulsive when they're youthful, and they change. And the other important point is that the older people who come out of prison after serving decades inside are not the drivers of crime when they come out. In fact, they tend to be stabilizing forces in their community because they have credibility and they can persuade younger people to desist before they commit crimes that will land them in prison. And some of that work is happening on the inside right now through the programs that Mike was referring to, including the True program and the Worth program at York. And those are folks who, when they're released, have the opportunity, the resources, and the credibility to serve their communities when they come out. The other point that I want to make is that one of the criticisms that some of the people who have occasioned this backlash against the board have been saying is that when people accept plea deals, that's somehow some sort of a contract that is supposed to be binding forever in terms of their sentence. That was never true. Commutation and other sentencing relief has always been available in the state of Connecticut, as it should be, as it is at this time in every other state of the union except Connecticut. Connecticut now is the only state in the union that does not have a functioning commutation system. And the reality is that this misunderstanding about pleas being contracts is something that the public should understand is just not true.
Mike and Miriam on Zoom, and to my left we have Chris Keating joining us on the Wheelhouse, and I get to play a clip for Chris right now. It comes from Heather Summers, a Republican state senator from Groton.
The Board of Pardon and Paroles took it upon themselves in the cloak of darkness under COVID to create a policy that now allows vicious murderers, rapists, those who have committed multiple murders to have their sentences commuted by decades. not by 1 or 2 years, but decades.
Why has there been so much backlash to the increase in commutations from victims' families and Republican lawmakers, Chris?
I've been at some press conferences and things of that nature. I think word spreads around. There was one particular case, a family that's come to the Capitol, the Carleton family, in which the daughter was killed in their own home by essentially an ex-boyfriend. I don't know. The issue of crime is out there. If you turn on the news every single day, you see it. And this whole thing seemed to be a little bit of a perfect storm, and it got the attention of the governor, and it increased more because these people are up for renomination. We should remind your listeners that just Thursday of this week, meaning 2 days from now, the House is going to be voting on Carleton Giles, who we've mentioned on this program here. Everybody has to be approved by both chambers. There's a vote on Thursday on Carleton Giles, and there's also a vote on the new chair who's going to be taking over for Carleton Giles. So anyway, crime is in the news. It's out there. The only other thing I wanted to add is, as a guy who covered the courts somewhat briefly when I wasn't doing politics, it's not that easy to get into prison. It's kind of hard. You got to do something very, very bad. It really is. And I've sat in a lot of courtrooms and seen people not sent to prison.
I guess I got a fun surprise for you, Chris. On the line, I believe, at this time right now, we have State Senator Heather Summers. Go ahead, State Senator. Your comment. Go ahead.
Yes, I was listening to you this morning, and I wanted to call in to clarify a few things that had been said. We heard that this board of pardon and paroles are experts, but that is, in fact, is not accurate. These are not experts. These are individuals that are appointed by the governor. You have some people that might have been police officers years ago. You have history teachers. There is no qualifications. There is no requirements of study, areas of study to be appointed to this board of pardon and paroles. And I think that what is important here is that of the Board of Pardon and Paroles, at the time that these changes were made to the policy, which again were made without legislators knowing, there was one person on the Judiciary Committee that clearly knew, but other than that, no one knew. So this is not only to the governor and to the Judiciary Committee, but to legislators here in the state of Connecticut. There was 3 individuals deciding on the pre-screening, and those same 3 individuals carrying out the commutation. So this is not a full board approval either. And if you look at the record, this is not a claim, this is a fact. You can go to the Board of Pardon and Paroles and actually pull down the data. Of the 71 commutations that were granted in Connecticut last year, 44 of them were for some of the highest crimes that we have here in the state of Connecticut. Now, I heard someone say earlier,
Heather, just really quickly, I apologize to interrupt you here, but we're up against a break. Just a quick end to your comment here, if you can.
It's time that the state of Connecticut include victims' families in this conversation. I want to thank the governor for having the wherewithal to take a look at this and to have all stakeholders at the table when we revise this policy here in the state of Connecticut. And there is a story, another side to the story that's not being told here this morning. So I think it's important that people do their research on both sides. And this is a bipartisan effort. That needs to be clarified. This isn't just a Republican initiative. Democrats have also come along and voted against the reappointment of these individuals to the Board of Pardon and Paroles. Thank you.
State Senator, thank you for calling in. Miriam, really quickly before we go to break, a little bit of a complaint about the qualifications of members of the board there from State Senator Summers. What do you have to say?
The reason that I called them experts is because they're people who see many, many cases over time. And so they're people who have experience in assessing all of the factors that we talked about, which do include victims' voices. There is no question the victims hold a very significant place in having their voices heard in the commutations process in the state of Connecticut, and they always have. And the reason that I called these folks experts is because, first of all, as she mentioned, there are police officers, there are people who work with youth, there are people who have worked in the Department of Children and Families, as the current chair has, who I would consider to be experts in the kinds of developmental issues and criminal justice issues that we want to be considered when we look at whether someone should be given a second chance. And they see many, many cases. Unlike situations where only a governor or one single individual holds the commutation power, this is a situation where people see cases over time. They see the way the applications develop. They see the nature of the people who are coming up repeatedly again and again and again. In that sense, they are experts. And so I'm glad you gave me an opportunity to respond to that, as well as to the suggestion that victims have not been permitted to have a voice in the process. It's also very important to note that victims in the state of Connecticut and everywhere are not monoliths. They are people with varying views. There are victims advocates and victims themselves who have come out in support of second chances for people. I also want to say that this issue is now garnering national attention. For example, the group Fair and Just Prosecution, which is a group of prosecutors from around the country, have now written to the governor and to the board to express concern about the halt in commutations, because this is such an aberration in the way that criminal justice policy happens in any other jurisdiction in the United States.
Great discussion on commutation thus far. You heard the phone call from the state senator there, and a great conversation continued there by Miriam. And next, we're going to continue this conversation, getting into some comments from state Democrats on this process. We'll also talk a little bit about what Miriam just hit on there, the role of families in the commutation process and the roles the incarcerated people themselves do as well in applying for commutation. 888-720-9677, the number to call if you want to participate on the Wheelhouse. More after this break. From Connecticut Public Radio, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, and if you're just joining us, we've been talking about the process of commuting prison sentences in Connecticut and the recent controversy surrounding that. Here with me in studio to my left, I got Christopher Keating, the Capitol Bureau Chief of the Hartford Courant. Miriam Gohara's on the phone, the clinical professor of law at Yale Law School. She's actually on Zoom. Also on Zoom is Mike Lawler, professor of criminal justice at the University of New Haven. And if you'd like to join in on the conversation, give us a call, 888-720-9677. And Miriam sort of talked around this a little bit, but following the recent backlash, Governor Ned Lamont recently removed Carleton Giles, a former cop, as chair of the board. What do you make of that decision? Do you think he was basically pushed out?
Frankie, I'm sorry. I'm not sure who you're directing that to, but
that's to you, Miriam. Go ahead. Sorry.
To me? Okay, yeah. Let me just make one more point in response to Legislator Summers. She said that
she called in the last break, just for anybody tuning in, State Senator Heather Summers, who's been very involved in this issue. Go ahead, Miriam.
Yes, she said that victims' voices are not represented. What's ironic, actually, is that, as I understand it, the governor had a meeting of stakeholders in the last week or so, 10 days, and did not, as far as I know, include anyone who represents the interests of incarcerated people or their families, or public defenders or lawyers who are experts and who understand how this process works from that perspective. So I just want to make that point. As far as Chairperson Giles is concerned, he, again, was doing his job after the board had repromulgated its guidelines, had simply been one of the members of the three-person panel of the board that would assess the worthiness of commutation applicants. Because victims, and again, Senator Summers mentioned a particular family, I believe, or maybe it was Chris Keating earlier mentioned a particular family who staged a press conference about commutations. All the families that participated in that press conference didn't even have a commutation application accepted. None of the people who committed crimes against their family members were granted commutations. And so there was apparent outrage, I guess, that people were even permitted to apply for commutations. People are going to avail themselves of legal avenues for relief. They're going to do that. The board made a decision that those particular individuals were not worthy of release, and so they did not grant commutation. So how that redounds to the detriment of Chairperson Giles, I don't quite understand.
Yeah,
However,
you had said that he had done his job, and that's why I wanted to ask you, do you think he was basically pushed out in this whole, I guess, controversy?
He was indeed pushed out. And I know that there are people in the state of Connecticut who believe that he served admirably and have very serious concerns about the way this process went down. It sends a very dangerous message that you're a public servant who is doing your job, who is acting in the interests of the holistic sense of how the criminal legal system should be functioning. And you would be pushed out for that is a very disturbing trend. And then not only that, but to push out an individual and then shut down the process entirely, leaving Connecticut singularly situated in the country right now without a functioning commutation system is a very serious misstep. And I might add that Democrats won the legislature, they won the governor's mansion, and this was after Republicans tried to make an issue of crime in the last election. Voters decided that they wanted the Democrats, notwithstanding Republican allegations that Democrats were being soft on crime. It's also important to note that national polling on the issue of second chances and clemencies suggests that 68% of Americans believe that clemencies and commutations are an important function in the criminal justice system and should be permitted in appropriate cases. And that's bipartisan polling. So that should really enhance and embolden people who are thinking about this in the way that they should be, which is that this is an important safety valve in our criminal justice system.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, Miriam, and I want to include Chris and Mike on the conversation, the broader conversation of why this crime policy is sort of brought up in this political manner. But first, we're going to take a phone call. We're going to go to the phone lines right now, 888-720-WNPR. We have Sammy, who's calling us from the road, who I understand is also a DOC, Department of Correction chaplain. Go ahead, Sammy. What's your comment today?
Thank you for taking my call. I will just
Thank you for calling in.
Yeah, these comments are mine and do not represent my department. I have been in the DOC and I see how these inmates come in and how they leave. I sat on the Zoom for the commutations of several of my inmates. All but one of my inmates have been granted commutation. The first thing that happened in that Zoom call was the victims' family presented their arguments first. So to say that they're not represented is not true. And some of these men, when they are leaving as leaders of men. I know how they came in. I see them. They're still coming in. They come in as criminals, as hoodlums, and they go through a process that is very similar to grief. First, there's their anger, the rejection of what's happening to them. But you should come and see what I see every day of my working life. These men transform, especially around the 9, 10, 11-year period. One of my guys was commuted after 26 years, and his initial sentence was 999 years for a crime he did not commit because they already admitted, the prosecutors, that they withheld evidence. So it is a very important process that we have in this commutation, and putting it on hold is a misjustice at this stage.
Thank you for calling in, Sammy. I greatly appreciate your phone call this morning. And I'm going to squeeze in another phone call here as well, 888-720-WNPR, 888-720-9677. We have a phone call right now from Daniel, who's calling us from Waterbury. Go ahead, Daniel. What's your comment on the wheelhouse?
Hi, how you guys doing this morning? I just wanted to say I was incarcerated for 17 years. I had a 23-year sentence. I didn't get a commutation, but I got a sentence modification. And since I've been home a little over 3 years now, I don't know if I can say my probation officer's name on over there or not, but if you would speak to her, she'll tell you that I've been a model person. Like, I grew up in prison, and I know firsthand that there's a lot of people in there doing a lot of time for mistakes they made when they were very young and immature, and they're not the same person. Like, there's a lot of people in there who take advantage of the Pell Grant. I was one of them. Like, I had to write for my English class, like a 4,000 page report solving any problem I can in the world. And one of them was the criminal justice system. And it's a proven fact that with love, with education, the recidivism rate drops. Even if you take a class and flunk, the chances of you coming back to prison are less than someone who never took a class at all. And me being a part of the DOC for the years I was in there, I know they don't promote education. They don't promote a lot of these things, and it's an institutional flaw in the DOC. I had to fight and fight to get in these programs, to get into school. I got denied the Pell Grant the first couple times. But there's a lot of people in there that are just like me who fought and fought and fought and is making through these obstacles and are still getting denied. And we're getting looked at as really terrible people where we made mistakes when we were younger. And that doesn't and it shouldn't define who we are now as grown men.
Daniel, thank you so much for calling in today. I appreciate it, and good luck on the rest of your journey here as you're post-incarceration. 888-720-WNPR was the number to call. We appreciate that call. You're kind of getting a sense of how important the process of commutation is to people in the state of Connecticut. Currently, it is suspended. So, Miriam, I think I want to direct this next question to you here. How do we kind of square this decision to remove Giles from the board with the fact that the Lamont administration had, I guess, a pretty good track record when it comes to criminal justice reform, or at least overall, as I'm not going to ask this question to Mike because Mike was a very big part of this, but at least overall in the last 10 years, Connecticut has been a state known to be very involved with criminal justice reform and trying to make sure that it's more about rehabilitation than incarceration. What are your thoughts, Miriam?
Thank you for that, Frankie, because that is one of the things that has caused us great concern. Before I turn to that, I just want to make a point that Sammy made when he called in the prison chaplain, because one of the things that we've learned through our representation of incarcerated people is that the people who are most proximate to them in prison, including correctional officials, including wardens, former wardens, and others who ran programs in the prison, fully support second chances. They support our clients' bids for second chances because they see what Sammy described as the trajectory of rehabilitation and the service that those people provide in prison and are capable of providing outside of prison. To get to your question, Connecticut has been a leader. Connecticut has been a second chance society. And what's really troubling about this is that it's a significant turn away from that for reasons that are purely political and don't square with good public policy or data-driven criminal justice legislation or litigation or reform or agency action or any of it. It's actually counter to data. Again, what we know is that people who serve long prison sentences are not the drivers of crime when they come out. They have long aged out of it. As our most recent caller just eloquently described, often availed themselves of programs, self-education while they're incarcerated, and they come out and they're actually contributing members of their society and they're able to support their families for the first time in years. Another group that has written to the governor and to the new board chair to express their deep concern about this is a national organization called We Got Us Now, which is comprised of people who have grown up with parents who are incarcerated. When we permit people an opportunity to return to their communities, we permit them an opportunity to contribute and support their families. And that's what Connecticut had recognized. Connecticut had been a leader on second chances. Connecticut had abolished the death penalty. Connecticut had revamped the commutation process. Connecticut had limited the use of solitary confinement. These were all data-driven decisions that the state made.
We're about to go to a break here, Miriam, because we only have about a minute or so left in the segment. So I'm just going to give a quick shout here to Mike Lawler, 30 seconds or less. Mike, do you think this strategy here that we've seen by the Republicans to bring up this issue and make it a big political issue in Connecticut, do you think this is going to help them at the polls coming up in the next few months and maybe next year as well?
I mean, I was in the legislature 24 years, so I can look back 40 years, and pretty much every single time except the time John Rowland first got elected, it hasn't worked, right? But I just want to clarify one thing that Heather Summers said a minute ago. Right in the state law, there's explicit requirements to be a member of the parole board, and they all are about specific expertise in this kind of stuff. So that's in the law. Also, there's a staff there who are very specially trained in this kind of thing, which provide the insights to the board members as they consider their decisions. And that includes a risk assessment tool that's state of the art. They have a full-time psychologist there to screen out the psycho killers among these guys who are applying. So, I mean, it is ridiculous to say, as one of her colleagues said, these are unelected bureaucrats. And I know why politicians say stuff like that. They say it to diss people. But
Chris, I'm
prosecutors
sorry,
or the
Mike.
judges, they're not elected either.
I gotta jump on you here because I only got about 30 seconds left in the segment. Love taking on callers today here and getting their perspective as well. But we had Chris in the studio to my left. Just really quickly, Chris, how do you think it's going to play out over the next couple of months? Is there any chance that we maybe stop halting this process and maybe bring back commutations? What do you think we should look out for?
I think it's going to continue. I mean, yes, I would assume they will eventually resume, but in this short period, I don't know if you want to call it a cooling off period or whatever. The board has to reset where it is. You have to remember that the new chair is brand new, and to reassert her position. She's been on the board a long time. Don't get me wrong, but
Jennifer Zaccagnini, yeah,
correct. When you have a new chair, sometimes it's a new day. Lamont wanted to put her in there. He pushed Giles aside. Giles is remaining on the board, just so your listeners remember that. He's remaining on the board. He wasn't completely ousted. It's going to continue, and it's going to take some time.
Thank you so much. We got to cool down this conversation here. I was loving it. It was a great conversation to have on commutations. Thank you so much to Chris, Miriam, and Mike for joining us today. When we come back, just really quickly, we're going to hit on medical aid in dying and its stalling in the legislature. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're moving now from commutations to another issue that stirred up debate at the state capitol this year. 15th time a bill like this has been proposed in Connecticut since 1995. Medical aid in dying legislation introduced once again this session. But last week, members of the Judiciary Committee decided against bringing it to a vote. Here to walk us through all that and more on the phone, good friend of the show, Christine Stewart, editor-in-chief of CT News Junkie. Good morning, Christine.
Good morning, Frankie.
Thank you for coming on, and I guess we got to talk about, once again, the end of aid in dying legislation in Connecticut for the legislative session. I want to talk about what is medical aid in dying, how does it work, what's this conversation been like here for lawmakers in Connecticut?
So this year the bill was a little bit different. It included more safeguards than previous iterations. So it required patients to be at least 21 years old, have less than 6 months to live, be a resident of Connecticut for at least a year, and 2 doctors would be required to sign off on the patient's condition, and non-relative witnesses would have to attest to their state of mind. So, supporters of the bill thought that those guardrails would be enough to win over skeptical members of the Judiciary Committee, but it wasn't enough. There just weren't enough votes there.
I want to get into a little bit of why this whole thing kind of fell apart, and I have a clip that I'd like to play. It comes from Steve Staffstrom, who is a state representative in the state of Connecticut.
Before we saw legislative efforts and litigation efforts in other states to undo many of the protections we've tried to put into this bill for Connecticut residents. And with those questions still percolating through the court, and with our neighboring states having not taken up this type of legislation, Massachusetts and in New York, I think that there are still some outstanding issues, and we are right to be cautious on it.
Steve is a state representative out of Bridgeport. So, Christine, it sounds like Steve and some of his colleagues may have been more supportive of it early in the session, and it seems like lately they're just not down for it. Maybe those safeguards, they're worried about legal challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like being worried about legal challenges is just an excuse not to pass legislation. There's always going to be legal challenges. That didn't stop them from abolishing the death penalty prospectively. And then there was the legal challenge to, eliminate all of death row. And, that took a few years to play out, but it played out. So I think that's just, it's just an excuse not to take up a big piece of legislation that is going to take, hours and hours and hours of debate amongst other pieces of legislation. So maybe it was a priority issue. So there have been 10 states and Washington, D.C. that have passed that have medical aid in dying. Some of them were done by ballot measure. Some of them were done by the legislature. The last state to pass medical aid in dying was New Mexico in 2021. So it's been a few years. And then we also have Vermont passed it in 2013, and Vermont is looking to open up the law to allow for non-residents to come up and avail themselves of this. And that would be the closest state to Connecticut. Well, also New Jersey, the legislature passed it. I'm not sure if there's residency requirements, though.
Christine, two sides to this issue. Can you get into that? And then I guess secondly, when we look at this issue, I want to know how some folks that are stakeholders in this have reacted to aid in dying once again not being passed in the legislature.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely, obviously, there are two sides to it. Some people have objections for religious reasons. Some people object because they believe it would be there would be some sort of effort to eliminate people who have higher healthcare costs and maybe disabled. And supporters of the bill say that that's not good enough. And what's interesting about this bill is that because it is such I want to say maybe a moral issue for people, that it and a religious issue, that it doesn't fall along party lines. So it's really difficult to determine what the support is in the legislature. But this is basically the same way the bill died last year was it passed public health like it did this year, and then it died in the Judiciary Committee, which is a much bigger committee, and so a lot tougher to gauge people who support or decline. And it's hard to win people over on an issue when it's such a personal issue for people.
We have time for one more caller to call in today. Just a real quick comment here from Kathy. Give us a comment if you can, Kathy. Thank you for calling into the Wheelhouse.
Thanks, Frankie, for having me on. I think the key thing is that there is a perspective against physician-assisted suicide, medical aid in dying from a disability justice and progressive perspective that has absolutely nothing to do with religion. And I also think the fact that the legal challenges in those other states to get rid of safeguards were being brought and supported by the proponents of the bill in this state gave people pause. And I'm just really glad that the Judiciary Committee really seemed to listen and engage with those of us who are opposed for disability justice reasons, whereas the Public Health Committee seemed to disregard our perspective entirely.
Thank you so much for calling in this morning, Kathy. Just really quickly here as we come to an end with this program, Christine, it really seemed like, as you were talking about the safeguards that were put in, one of them you mentioned was a time period in place when people come to Connecticut for them to then participate in the program if they were terminally ill and they wanted to have the right to sort of end their life. And then you talk about even getting more, I guess, a second opinion from a doctor. Tight restrictions. How could there be, I guess, even more tight restrictions to try to get this through next year? What do you think, Christine?
I don't know. I think that some of the opponents of the bill within the Public Health Committee suggested that, there should have been a task force instead. And so usually they come up with task forces when they don't actually want to act. A task force to, take the next year to go over the issue and determine if there are greater restrictions that need to be put in place. So that
about 15 seconds left, Christine.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as Kathy said, the disability community is concerned about there being enough protection, and I think that's fair, and that's what lawmakers will look at next year.
Thank you so much for calling in, Christine. Today's show produced by Meg Dalton, technical producer Kat Pastor. Thank you so much to our guests, Katie Tolarski helping us in studio. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app.